Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 93rd New Social Environment. I'm Lewis, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Martha Tuttle and Susan Harris. We're also thrilled to have the poet Gabriel Dozal here, who will read to close today's program. A few quick notes before we get started. We'll be recording this gathering for the Rail Archive. If you would prefer not to be seen, you can disable your camera by pressing the stop video button in the bottom left corner of your screen. If you have questions, please write them in the chat, and I will call on you to speak during the Q&A, or I'm happy to read the question on your behalf. Feel free to introduce yourself and shout out where you're from in the chat. The Rail team will also be helping out with tech if you have any questions, and we'll be typing closed captions. You can turn those on by pressing the CC button at the bottom of your screen. The Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that we are on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. We acknowledge the many indigenous nations with ties to this land, and we recognize that the Lenape still call Mannahatta home. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprising unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, and Toyin Salau, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. Before I introduce our host, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's host. Susan Harris is an independent scholar and curator specializing in drawing and women artists. She curated a monographic exhibition of Frank Moore with Lynn Gumpert at the Gray Gallery, a Pat Steer drawing survey with Jan Howard at the RISD Museum and the Neuberger Museum. She organized exhibitions of Richard Tuttle at the Serralves Museum in Porto, Portugal, and at CGAC in Santiago de Compostela, Spain, and exhibitions of Nancy Sparrow and Jim Hodges at CGAC as well. She curated Venus Drawn Out, 20th Century Drawings by Great Women Artists for the Armory Show in 2014. She was managing editor of Unfinished Memories, 30 Years of Exit Art, out from Steitel in 2016. In addition to her frequent contributions to the Rail, she has served as guest critic for the November 2016 issue on the topic Recalling the Saints. She serves on the board of the International Association of Art Critics, United States section, Printed Matter, and the Brooklyn Rail. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Lewis, for that introduction. Well, welcome all to Friday, July 24th. I want to start out by reminding all of us that we have 102 days before we exercise our privilege to vote for Joe Biden as the 46th President of the United States. So we all need to focus and make that happen. Meanwhile, today it's the Brooklyn Rail's 94th New Social Environment Zoom conversation, and I'm happy to be here for that. I'm really proud to be a contributor to the Rail as well as a board member. As a writer and as a reader, I've loved the Rail for being one of the most meaningful platforms, the last actually, one of the last written ones, print ones, that brings together arts, politics, and ideas. I want to thank Fong, my inspiring, indefatigable friend and visionary, as well as each and every one of the amazing Brooklyn Rail staff, Lewis, Charlie, Nick, Sophia, Madeline, Catherine, John, Malvika, Claudio, Emily, Georgia, Everett, Miko, Tyler, and Cal. I hope that's everyone. You all climb to Herculean heights every day and bringing us all together in this ever-expanding community by organizing these incredible programs and people that have been keeping our brain cells and our spirits alive and aloft. But I want to especially thank Martha Tuttle for agreeing to join me today to talk about her art, her life, her influences, and her inspirations. It's an exciting moment for her, having recently installed a beautiful project at Storm King called a stone that thinks of Enceladus, which of course she'll show us and talk about. Having had her first professional one-person show as recently as 2016, her art accomplishments are all the more impressive. So I'm going to give a brief biographical introduction, and then Martha will begin showing us slides, and we'll take it from there. Martha was born in 1989 to her parents, poet Meme Bursenbrugge and artist Richard Tuttle in Santa Fe, where she grew up between there and New York City. She graduated from Bard College in 2011 and got her MFA from Yale in 2015. Martha has held numerous residencies, including the Rauschenberg Residency and the Montello Foundation Residency in 2019, the Sharp Walenta Studio Program and AZ West and Joshua Tree in 2017. In 2016, she did a UCross Foundation Fall Residency in Clearmont, Wyoming, and she received a Joseph Albers Foundation Traveling Fellowship, as well as a Donald C. Gallup Research Fellowship from the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts Library at Yale in 2014. Martha has had 7 one-person exhibitions and has been included in numerous group exhibitions. Her work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the University of San Diego, California. She currently lives in Brooklyn and is represented by Tilton Gallery and Rona Hoffman Gallery. So Martha, hi.
Hi, Susan. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone at the Rail for having us in conversation. It's a pleasure to be with you all.
Do you want to start showing slides and we can
Go from there.
take it from there?
So it's been wonderful to plan this conversation with Susan because she is such a deep looker at art, but also because she's brought up many things that are important to me that in my fast brain, I haven't gotten the chance to focus on for a little while. Yeah, so we just prepared a collection of images, hopefully touching on some things that are the most relevant. But one of the things that we first started speaking about was my own interest in delicacy and vulnerability, and creating an art conversation which welcomes a dialogue about what care is, and hopefully makes that as complex as possible. And so this is an image of my own work on the left, and the image on the right is a Hellenistic head of a Greek statue of a woman in mourning. And for me, it interested me to think about a stone holding emotion, that emotion in this particular image being grief, and also the implication of transparency in a material as materially hard as marble. In my own work, it's the transparent materials are painted with stone dust. That pink on the left is also a marble dust.
I mean, Martha had shown this image of the Hellenistic sculpture in a lecture, and I find it remarkable in and of itself, but how it really encapsulates the qualities of your work, which, you know, seems so ethereal and immaterial, but so too does this. I mean, it's just breathtaking. So I think that sets us up for the qualities that are a motif in your work.
Well, I think something that I'm very interested in is figuring out how a person forms a sense of intimacy with their world, especially now. one of the reasons why I am happy to be working in Brooklyn itself is I think that often our urban environments where art is centered are ones in which we forget that we're living on Earth in a place with a history. And so it's interesting to think through these issues in this particular place. My work, though, does derive a sense of relationship to place based on being from rural New Mexico and growing up with the landscape there. This image is an image of videos that I'm working on for my next exhibition with Tilton Gallery. And this is me walking in December. At the time, Susan, I was telling you I had like a terrible fever, so the whole thing really ended up feeling like a trippy dream. It's kind of comical to see the images and to work with the footage now and to remember being a body in that space. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions that come up that maybe we'll get to, but I wanted to show this image of these videos that I'm working on. I think that in my material work, because they read so much as aesthetic objects, sometimes the research-based components and the conceptual language that I hope that they share isn't readily apparent. And so I think the questions that I'm having now is how can this conversation be forefronted, and how can what I'm thinking about and what I think is important to express become part of an active visual conversation while the collaboration with this non-human matter of the material still is a part of the work. So hopefully this body of work will be a forward step in that, if not a altogether answer. Yeah, I wanted to show you all this image. This is from a show in 2018 in Italy. The show was called Oracles. And those two works on the wall are closer to what I call my wall works. They're woven and spun wool and then painted silk. But the piece on the floor was one of the first real sculptures that I made. And it is also called Oracles. And it is 600 stones, about 300 cast from steel, and the other half gathered pebbles from a beach on Long Island. And they were scattered on the floor. One thing I'm kind of thinking a lot about is how scale enters into my work. And in general, I'm interested in things that are both very small and very large. But what interests me, what continues to interest me about this sculpture is that it can change in scale in whatever space that it's in.
I wanted to ask you about this because I just saw it for the first time yesterday. So the stones on the floor are not part of the works on the wall. Those are separate works?
I see it as a single separate sculpture.
Single set, right. And so what, I know you, and we'll see this later, how you use a single stone within your wall works, between panels of your wall works. But so what motivated you to do this piece on the floor? This scatter piece, as it were.
That's a great question. I think the idea of them looking like constellations, and because the floor of the gallery itself was gray and polished, that they reflected onto themselves. So looking at this river of stars in the ground was, I think, my main motivation. Yeah. But I think that pebbles themselves, I got interested initially. Well, I'm not sure if I've ever not been interested in but I went to this lecture about Neolithic tools, and the archaeologist was discussing a site that had been excavated, and they had found a jasper, perfectly round jasper stone, and that had been worked a little bit, but was pretty organically round. And in the talk, the archaeologist was like, but this comes from 200 miles away. And then he went by it. But I couldn't stop thinking about that, because it's like, what, this is like pre-pockets. It's like pre-needle and thread, like any kind of bag element. So everything had to be, in my imagination at least, carried by hand. And so this object, which was not necessarily a use object in the way that we would define it, was thought of as interesting enough for this person to have picked it up and carried it 200 miles, even though many other things could have been carried. And I feel like still we all have that experience of seeing a rock and picking it up and holding it. And just that felt to me like this almost unconscious, beautiful repetition of a connection, a small connection. And so my work with stones has gone from there, but I feel like it still continues to go back to that, hearing that talk.
Nice, nice. So this was your first real sculpture, as it were.
Yeah, and we've spoken about how that's a little bit of a silly terminology.
Yeah, it is.
Very physical and involves welding and glass casting. Yeah. So, but I guess I would define it as a sculpture in that it is a freestanding physical object. That's a super stupid way to define a sculpture, but it's
right.
It's been in my head.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and I wanted to throw, this is jumping in time a little bit, but I wanted to throw this image in. This is a painting from last winter. And so the use of these objects and this interest in how a very compact stone can be included in these transparent painting works has continued. And these are two panels that hold together a piece of quartz. What also interests me about these objects that are incorporated is that they will far outlast both the paintings, but also myself, probably human beings in their current material form. So talking about scale again, I'm very interested in how one object, and in fact many, many objects that we encounter, have these vastly varying time frames just by the components that they're made up of.
I love this too for the space that is created by inserting the stone in between the panels. And then it's harder to see in the images, but the different levels of transparency and opacity. And you can see the stretcher bar behind that, which then makes you aware not only of the structure of the work, but the wall behind. So yeah, that's, you can see. But getting back to the space in between, it sort of goes in, it relates to what you were saying in terms of this other sense of time and space beyond, the work itself.
It's very hard for me to not think of paintings, at least my own, as bodies, as forms in the world. And the relationship between the skeleton and skin, to me, is always so clear, whether it's a Renaissance painting or one made today. But for me, something that I like to be aware of with my body is that I look at myself and I think I have this boundary when in fact I'm very porous. Things are passing through me all the time. And I think, the recent virus has made that very clear to us, but also beautiful health healthy things pass through us. I think it's all this collective. And I think our cells are being replaced and altered, and that state of change being a constant is our physical relationship to the world. And then I think paintings, the way that we look at them, tend to be, or often are presented as this bound state and the singular state that don't include the space or the environment around them. And I think that is often how we talk about our own bodies. And so it felt to me really interesting, in simple terms, to bring in the wall around the work, to bring in the wall behind. And hopefully there's less of a clear boundary in these works than if they are single panels.
Well, I don't know if you want to talk about this too, but in that lecture you gave in 2016, you spoke about, you know, your process being intertwined with your questions or attempts to understand what it means to be matter in a world of matter. So that's sort of identifying with the matter of the universe, and that, you know, that the original matter of the universe is the same matter of our origins. So, I mean, I thought that was like an incredibly cool concept. Maybe obvious, but not. But that you said you found it reassuring because it made you feel a deep sense of belonging to the universe. So,
Yeah. I think as that was several years ago, I think that maybe I would translate the word belonging to responsibility now. And I think to me that we are not separate from the material world that we occupy and that we are made up of is and has become more strongly an ecological question to me. And I think that often the way that ecology or conservation is spoken about, which is not wrong, but is that we are doing something to the world that we live on, which is at times true. But I think it's still re-emphasizing that we are separate. And I think to be separate is often, at least in our current understanding, to create a hierarchy. And so I'm not sure of how this is possible, but I have an instinct that realizing our own intertwinedness with the physical world, the mattered world, our Earth, but also our galaxy, and what we can see, such as, you know, a tree, a river, a pipeline, and what we can't, the atoms and microbes that make up our world. I have a feeling that a conversation about being intertwined with our world will bring a sense of ecology forward. So yeah, in that sense, and I think there's a tremendous amount of responsibility in feeling an awareness of connection.
thank you.
Yeah. Well, should we move on?
Yeah, let's move on.
Stepping back a little bit in time.
Right.
This is from a show called I Long and Seek After, which is a title at Tilton Gallery. The title comes from a Sappho poem. And as many of you know, and Sappho poems come to us, they are fragments, and many of the lines are lost. So when they're put on on the page. I really love Anne Carson's translations, but they're shared with these great moments of space. And so because this was when I started thinking about hopefully incorporating the space around a painting with the painting itself, that title, and thinking about, what we still have even when we don't know what it is or when it is invisible, was a driving factor of the show. So these works, as I mentioned earlier, all of the thicker portions, what reads as the thicker portions, are wool that is spun by me and woven. I got really into spinning, both for its mythological and historical technological relationships, but also because it was a way for my body to touch every element of the piece. And then the silk components are painted with, in this case, graphite, but also other materials such as coal dust and residue from cutting lapis lazuli. And there's just a few more sides of this show.
Well, it's an opportunity to talk about, the elements of the works themselves and how you came upon this particular way of working and to use, spinning and weaving and dyeing and,
I think because touch and having a physical connection to my practice has always just felt instinctually really important to me. This way of making that incorporated my hands and, dyeing a piece of fabric is very hot and labor intensive, and I boil this wool so it felt, and so the objects themselves, I hope, come to a simple conclusion, but then the processes really, really engaged a lot of physicality, so that was really interesting to me. I would also just say that between undergrad and graduate school, I worked at a fiber center in Española, New Mexico, and that's where I learned a lot of these techniques. But then when I went to grad school for painting, for me, like, even the brush felt like too great a distance, just again, instinctually. I have nothing against brushes, but I was just always looking for, like, how can I become more engaged as a kind of a way of knowing, and I'm still working that out, but I think that there's sometimes when you see something really beautiful and you're like, I love it so much, like I desire to be looking at it while I'm looking at it, and the other way of describing that, I think, is like, I love it so much I want to, like, eat it, even if it's a landscape. And so I to me, that level of kind of ecstatic, like, love is what I want to get to with my practice. So having that, like, intense attempt to incorporate the materials into my body through the process was really interesting. But then, of course, there's this other side of where it will always be separate from me in its finished form. So I think that the processes come out of that two-sided.
Right. Well, I'm not an artist. I'm not a painter. I've had a lifetime fantasy of weaving, which I hope to, live out one day. And so it may sound ridiculous to all the artists, but it seems to me that weaving is a process in which you could get lost. I mean, more so than painting. Again, I feel a little ridiculous saying that, not being an artist. But that in the process of weaving, I mean, you are creating the structure and every element of it, the structure, the surface, and the content and the subject matter, as opposed to painting. And I'm wondering if in the process of spinning and weaving, there's like a hypnotic aspect to it that, you know, plays into the work.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people there is, for sure. And I've maybe gotten there a few times. I think a lot of other weavers are some of the most up-to-date podcast listeners that you'll ever meet. It's not meditative for me, even though I think that I understand why that quality it is. It's actually like super duper boring, but I love boredom. I think like boredom is one of the most fascinating emotional states. And I wish that I could tell you like I get bored and then I break through it and get to the other side and have these like vast revelations. But I really like going through like the kind of irritation, the frustration, the momentary stops in where your mind wanders and then comes back. And so I actually think, I hope it's not facetious to say, but like I'm into it for the boredom. But I think most people that I speak to do often have a relationship to a meditation and a kind of contemplative state.
All right. Well, that's fascinating.
This was a show last summer at Rona Hoffman Gallery called The Dance of Atoms. And this show was, I just wanted to show some images from it. It was really important to me in that these works were all made from drawings of how Lucretius describes atoms interacting with each other and alone. And I think that my work has an engagement with abstraction, but to me, the interest in the physical and through material is concrete. And so making works that came from specific drawings was really engaging practice to me. Again, here you can see the slanted stretcher bars. The black ones are charred using fire, which is, to me, a reference back to the kind of transformation of atomic matter that Lucretius refers to so often.
So you plan the configurations which has to go back to your building of the frames through with drawings.
Yeah, I have recently discovered drawing on Photoshop. It's mind-blowing. But at this point, I was still drawing on 2 sheets of tracing paper, and one would be the stretcher, and then one would be the paintings, and then I would cut them out and like paper dolls, move them over one another to match the best drawing with the best stretcher.
Because they become increasingly elaborate.
Yeah. So it's a series of them, and you're absolutely right. They grow in complexity, and this is a painting from the same series, but the stones themselves are held by tension of the panels. In recent years, as I spoke about in the beginning, I find that every new body of work is determined by a lot of research and a lot of writing and a lot of kind of thought gathering. And I want to figure out a way to share that without necessarily having the work lose its openness. So I've been producing zines and artist books with each show, and they just handed out to the audience. this booklet was for the Dance of Atoms. And the image on the right is from the Tucson Mineral Fair. They were emphasizing quartz as their mineral of the year. And then the image on the right is a strangler fig tree, which are these very interesting, potentially parasitic, but maybe not, trees or vines in Florida. And I was at the Rauschenberg residency at the time, and I was very fascinated by the porosity that they make.
I've been struck since we started talking about your work about, you know, the research and the range of your inquiries into literature and poetry and science, that seem to be really such a key part of your process.
Well, I feel like, I mean, and again, I think that I would never hold this to another artist's work necessarily, but, you know, no word, no material is separate from the world. And I think there's a certain point where it'll drive you crazy. And I think a lot of artists very bravely do the work to trace back the origins of their materials as best as possible. But then you do get into these really complicated questions of, well, what about the camera? What about the computer? Everything we touch has this connectivity to global practices that can get very complicated. And I would never claim to say that I'm invested to the degree that some people doing that work are, but I do feel that, you know, the more I think about the materials that I use, and again, this is why I think that they are conceptual, maybe as everything is because they link back to a land history, to a global history, to often a colonial history, and to a geological time-based history in so many ways. And I think similar to how I cannot absorb the materials that I am using, that there is in the research element of my work implied failure because it can never get everything. But I think even that is kind of a beautiful space of conversation, the inability to hold everything, but holding a little bit or making these charts of connection is really interesting to me.
Well, and just how you, it's about connectivity on all levels.
Yes.
So you're successful in communicating that. So this, wait, go back and why don't you explain this image?
Yeah, so this is an image from the Cassini Explorer, a NASA mission. It is of Enceladus, which is a moon of Saturn that is covered in ice and thought to be the most reflective surface of our in our galaxy. And the image of on the right is actually upside down, but it's of a geyser spewing mist in the sunlight, highlighting it. And the thought is that Enceladus is one of the only celestial bodies in our galaxy that really has every single ingredient for life, and that hasn't been explored properly. But when I started working on the project that we'll go into next, A Stone That Thinks of Enceladus, for the Storm King Outlook series upstate, I got really interested in these images of Enceladus covered in ice, and then the glass stones that I was making, and then thinking about this scale and how to create intimacy with a kind of vastness, whether that's a geological history or a sense of universal space. And so I wanted to just start with these images to share them with you.
That's a pretty amazing image.
I know, it's so wild. It's just, it also looks like skin, I think.
Yeah.
Really beautiful.
Yeah.
So this is the site in in, I think, January, which feels like a very long time ago. And in this site, the sculpture itself is about 100 stones that are cast out of glass, which I did mostly at Urban Glass. I did all in Urban Glass, and then some were donated to me from an artist, Joanne Lefrac, when the shutdown happened. And then 100 that are carved from marble, and they're placed in stone stacks and cairns on top of these boulders that are scattered throughout the field. I wanted to show you this image of what it looked like before, because as the project has continued, the grasses and the green of the leaves have ended up becoming a huge part of the work. Maybe we can go to the next slide.
Wait, can I just ask one question though? With the configuration of boulders there, is that how they were, or had you moved them?
Oh, we moved them.
At that point where that slide before in the winter.
Oh, that was where they were. Yeah, they were moved when the ground was still pretty frozen. So yeah, but they come from Storm King itself, mostly by the river there, and they were just by Mike Seaman, the director of operations, and his team carried them up to the site. I mean, using a forklift, but really heavy. Yeah, and as you can see, the grasses have started to grow, and it becomes a different piece. And that's something I really loved about working with outdoor sculpture, is that the piece itself changes from week to week. I imagine that's also true about indoor work, but we don't see it.
Right.
So maybe we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so here are some of the stone stacks. And these are glass and marble.
It's so frustrating just to see them, online. It seems like such a tactile experience, and just to see the relationship between the boulders and the sculpted rocks and the glass. Gosh, it looks pretty special. You did some research you did a lot of research in different directions for this piece on cairns, yeah?
I did. I mean, one of the things that I am interested in is technologies that are really old that most people have a relationship with. That's come out in a lot of my textile work. I like, even though I'm unfortunately, I wouldn't call myself a textile artist. I like sort of fudging and saying that I am to people like on the plane, because you get these super beautiful stories about how, their family member or their friends has this relationship to textile. And so I think that is something that I really liked about cairns as well, that most people have this relationship to them as marking hiking paths. But as soon as I started working on this project, I started getting images from people all over. And the one on the left is from curator Daisy Nam from Korea, and the one on the right is from Nora Lawrence, the curator at Storm King of Minnewaska State Park. But I have about, at this point, like 40 or 50 images of cairns. So I really loved that part of the project, and I'm now making a follow-up book of them. But cairns ended up becoming this really interesting thing as I went into them further, because even though we have this kind of felt interest, or it seems like a lot of people do, learning that they are this super old thing, dating back to the Neolithic period, or maybe even older. They might be pre-Homo sapien, and that they've existed around the globe ceremonially to represent food caches, entrances to the spirit world, and as well as a darker history of a relationship to surveying. And so I think that multiplicity seems to me to be mirroring the stone stacks themselves. And of course, in literature, they're prolific. Haldor Laxdis's book, Independent People, highlights the cairn. So I feel like I could go on a long time.
Yeah.
It's one of those subjects where there's not, it feels so obvious. There's actually not that much information on them, which is also something that interests me. Like, but yeah, so the images that I've received, I've been grateful for everyone. So please keep sending them to me, to all the people out there.
They're pretty magical. I mean, they add an additional magical element to the work. But so let's go back in terms of the process. We were looking at that image of you, I believe at Urban Glass, yeah?
Yeah. So the stones themselves were made through a process called casting, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But to cast glass, each stone requires its own mold. So I was working off about 7 different forms from stones that were gathered from Storm King. And I made silicone molds initially. So you can even see, if you get a chance to see the sculpture, you can see the imprints of the lichen and the cracks on the rocks. And then we would make waxes, and then from the waxes pour silica and plaster mold, steam the wax out, and then put the whole material in the kiln. And it would be about 3 or 4 days. Glass requires a long time to heat up and then cool down in order to not crack. So I definitely had help and a lot of guidance as this was a new process for me. But it was really such a physical relationship to every single stone. And that, of course, links up to my practice in a way that I like very much.
When did you do these?
I did them in January and February. So by chance, for the most part, they were made before the shutdown. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a friend who had been also coincidentally casting glass rocks for her own practice lent some to the project. Her name is Joanne Lefac. To me, I was thrilled by this, both because of her generosity, but because cairns, of course, are generally built by more than one person.
Oh.
So it ended up being an unexpected, I think, important part of the process.
That's nice. That's nice. And then, of course, the other, oh God, look at those.
Yeah. So this is an image of making them, and then one on the site from above. And then as the grasses really become part of the work, and then the sky itself. So the following are influence images that we put together, Susan, and I can go through them quite quickly if we're worried about time.
Well, no, I think we're good. Wait, I just want to ask one more question about the Storm King piece. The stones that you sculpted, that's another component.
So sculpted stones were made from marble. And I'm going to tell the story. My mom, I see, is in the participants, so I'm just going to embarrass her a little bit. My parents both got ill during this time, and I went out to New Mexico for a few months to be with them. And of course, as most artists, I was in the position of not necessarily knowing when this would open, if it would open. But through the hard work of the Storm King staff and also the changing environment, it was able to open in early July when we initially thought of in August. So I had to figure out how to find the marble and the tools in New Mexico in this like very short time window. And of course, as always happens, just through the generosity of other artists and other people, it just was possible. And then I found this guy who's been a stoneworker in Dixon for many, many years. And he was like, well, I don't have marble that size shape, but you can look through like my garbage pile. And so I ended up getting like 150 pounds of marble from his garbage, and then getting an angle grinder and then making it on the porch of my parents' home while spending time with them. And so I really love the marble aspect of this work, because I think, you know, we will all go forth and change is a constant. So this will not always be our reality, but I think that these stones, as much as they are part of this work that's not wed to this experience of making a project during COVID, they represent to me what it meant to go forward. And again, like the kind of generosity and collaboration that I had to ask for in order to make it possible. So I do really love the glass, but the marble stones have that very kind of special history as well.
Right. Well, and let's talk about this piece in particular. You know, was so impacted by COVID, and it is. I mean, congratulations, it's open, and you know what a gift it is to all the people that can visit it, although it's limited. So why don't maybe you want to, you know, share, you know, how the things changed at the last minute because of the quarantine, and what it means to have this piece up at a time when people are still somewhat quarantining.
When I was nervous about getting it done in time, a friend said, you know, it would mean so much, not that Storm King depended on my piece or not, but just that having somewhere to go to see art in person would mean so much to people. And I really, really agree with that. And so I think, you know, in a sense, being up at Storm King and seeing other people's work, I really, really love the Namjoon Pike sculptures pieces up there. It just has this added feeling, because you're seeing work that's meant to be seen in the way that it's meant to be seen. I think, of course, there are complications. The piece itself is very intertwined with a performance and poetry series that was meant to take place on the site. It is now moved to the virtual, and at first that felt, you know, like a questionable change, because this work deals so much with sight. Now I think there's something really beautiful about being able, because of the poets and performers who have agreed to work with the project are all ones who ask really great questions about place and environment. And I think being able to bring to mind those qualities, even when you are not able to access or embody a place, maybe because you can't travel or because access is limited. But I think that, yeah, the only thing is that you have to reserve tickets ahead of time at Storm King, but they're doing, I think, a really good job of trying to keep it as open to as many people as possible.
Well, but also your work, which depends so much on the notion of place, you know, it shifts, it expands, it you know, contracts, it changes. I mean, it's interesting. I think you know, it's so interesting to think about. You spent a lot of time researching, you know, the Hudson Valley, you know, from all points of perspective here. but now all of a sudden, starting, mid-March, there's a whole other factor that, people hundreds of years from now will research as well. But, what is place, and how important, is it to be in a place, or, through the wonders of technology, we can all be in a place now, and more people can be there, through technology. What's the value added of being there, and, touching, are you allowed to touch the rocks?
Yes, and the boulders certainly, from, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this. As far as I'm concerned, absolutely. I think I'm not sure about Storm King's policy. I feel that although my work is not, whether it can be touched or not, I don't want that to be the most strong emphasis. But I also feel fine about my work being touched. Not as delicate as it looks, I think.
Well, I just, the notion of place seems, pretty key to this piece. And
yeah. But I mean, I think that's all the question, right? Like, I think, on the one hand, like the importance of being a body in a place and the importance of places is non-negotiable, especially ones that are historically belonging to a people. And then simultaneously, as we are making art now, I mean, can we really like continue on the platform that one needs to be able to access it with their own body all the time? It seems limited. And so I don't know the answers to this right now, but I do feel that if there's a possibility of not just referring to a place like the Storm King site, but through my own words or through the performances of other people, at least trying to feel if there's a way to share that feeling through Zoom, through words. I think literature is actually a really great place to look for inspiration for this. I think music is also. These are really big questions, and I think, it turned what I thought I knew about the Storm King work into something that for me right now is unanswerable, but I think is actually like a huge moment of shift in my work for us all. But I think because I've been thinking about what it is to have an intimacy with a surrounding mattered world so strongly, that I feel like that that I'm aware that I need to rethink that, as we don't know in the next couple of years how we will be bodies together and bodies in places. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, is what I'm saying. I mean, I wish it weren't so, but I think as it is so, thinking about it, it's a chance to think about it. And I'm interested in that.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're thinking about it. We need that thoughtfulness and mindfulness in these times. Yeah, so let's go on. So these images that you have, I think just tell so much about you and your work, and if you feel so inclined to mention, why you include them.
Yeah, and we can flip through them quickly. I'll just say one or two lines about each one. This is a calendar stone in Caral in northern Peru. And this civilization was built between 2600 and 2000 BC. This is an image that I took in North Carolina, of the Appalachian Mountains. I was struck by a similar sense of feeling as in the Catskills, of which I was reminded that they are made by the same orogeny or mountain building events, and curious about how that sense of feeling can translate through the mountain ranges. These are two images of something called the Jeffersonian grid, or a public land survey plan, and they are images of how most of our country, largely the West, was attempted and successfully gridded, and it's interesting to me as a mark of how an abstraction like the grid, which is so prolific in contemporary art, also has this side of being deeply non-neutral. These are 3 books I'm reading. Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, her relationship to naming and magic. Schizophrene by Banu Kapil, and then Pedro Paramo, Juan Rulfo. This is a piece called Visions of an Island by Sky Hopinka, whose work I feel deeply in awe of. Agnes Varda's Vagabond. Nobuo Sukune Faye's Mother Earth. I've been thinking a lot about Manoha. In this piece, the earth taken from that emptied form is made into the cylinder above it. This is Koji Anokura, and the piece is called Symptom Sea Body in 1972, and it's just a photograph of his body along the contour of the ocean. One of the things I've been deeply fascinated by is the pursuit of studying dark matter, and dark matter, when it's condensed, is strong enough to bend light, but when it's floating through space, it is almost undetectable. It goes by the names, the acronym WIMP, which is weakly interacting matter particles, and those dark matter particles are flowing through our body all the time. But to study them, scientists have to go deep into minds, because that's one of the only places quiet enough to hear the frequency of these matter particles. So these are images of an abandoned gold mine in Lead, South Dakota. This is the image that they took last year of the black hole. And it isn't one image. It was taken by, I believe, 27 different observatories all around the world. So it's this collective form of image making that I think is super interesting. And then it took 2 years for the scientists to assemble all the images, all the data that was taken. And that this is the resulting image, and that this image itself is kind of this groundbreaking scientific work. To me, is really, really beautiful because it's so ethereal. This is an image by Billy Meyer, who's a UFOologist, Swiss UFOologist. I've been really getting into the X-Files, and I think thinking and that poster in Mulder's basement that I want to believe is a Billy Meyer image, and also thinking about belief in U.S. culture and belief in the occult, and how maybe thinking about like how belief has been filtered into pop culture has a lot of interesting things to say about belief in general. And so I've been really thinking a lot about that. Suzanne Kite, a interdisciplinary artist, also has an essay that I recommend called Who Believes in Indians, and relating about the history of thinking about Indigenous people and the history of believing in UFOs. So I would recommend that. And then the next is just a small video that I find weird and beautiful of a possible UFO crash in White Sands, New Mexico in 1997.
Oh, wow. Ah, wow. That's great. Martha, I have a million more things we could talk about, and I wanted to talk about, but I'm looking at the time, and I see there are a lot of questions. So maybe maybe some of the questions will include my questions.
Yes, thank you both for such an amazing conversation. And if we're ready to go to questions, our first one comes from our own publisher, Fong Bui.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Susan. It's unfortunate that we didn't manage to get to see the show, Cézanne, the Rotten Quarry, that John Elderfield worked for several years at Princeton University Museum. But I recommend that you should read his wonderful interview conversation with Terry Winters. But it just reminded me how Cézanne was so horrified that his beautiful painting site of landscape, from where he was living and going to work on the site, that he had painted so lovelily for so long, being desecrated, being destroyed by industry, by technology, science, and commerce, and so on. And it just brought my attention to your work, Martha. So I want to ask, in specifically, perhaps not that specific, but does your attention or your appeal to the color gray in all of this full, subtle, and not so subtle spectrum, as we see it's being explored in the paintings, in the sculptures, including the issue of opacity and transparency, appeal to the condition of being morally ambiguous and impartial? In other words, gray being the color of complexity, full complexity, but also, taking the present between the extremity of black and white, so does it at all sometimes evoke that sensibility?
I feel like that would be a very beautiful essay to read of yours. Personally, I would have to think about that more. It's an interesting thought. I guess two things just that come to mind about color is that often I feel like I'm using like really intense colors, and then people are like, wow, like great gray. And I'm like, oh no, it happened again. So I think perhaps I see more color than is readily apparent. The other thing is, since I was younger, small, I had these kind of before waking visions of this fog space and figures held within it. And I think a lot of my work is, not to be too psychoanalytical, but that fog space to me, because it happens so often before I awake, I think about the world kind of held in that distorted gray color. So I think that's personal. Maybe it's not relevant to the work, but I think I have an interest in gray because of that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because why Susan was asking about the hypnotic effect or the repetition and weaving, and I just don't know. It just occurred to me there's some similar kinship in the way that also via Samin, you know, treatment of her own cosmic totality in the rocks and the color gray that is predominantly painted over again with the same image and also the same palette of gray. But of course, it's all together different. But anyway, thank you for the answer.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Brian, and Brian has left, but I'm going to read the question on his behalf. How much does the tactility of materials enforce or preclude the work, Martha?
I don't think that this is a good answer to the question, but I've always felt that working with materials is a kind of like dancing with them. It's an engagement. And so I feel like if I'm really working, there's like a kind of energetic relationship that's formed that I don't really ever feel enforced or like anything other than again, it's like not a very good answer, but I think the materials that I choose, it is true that sometimes working with like stone or metal that I have this like history with fluidity of fabric, but then, you know, and I'm like, wow, like steel doesn't bend the way that I thought it would, and that definitely changes the work. But I don't really, I like listening to what the material wants to do. I feel like that's like a significant effect of the end results of the piece. But then I also prefer to sit with the material and figure out how it's going to work rather than finish a piece quickly. So I've never had the experience of working with material and feeling like enforced or like something needed to happen. Usually it's just like a matter of time, and figuring out how that thing wants, what it's trying to say, how it wants to be made, and figuring out how it's going to get there.
Thank you. We also had a question from Deanna in the audience. Deanna, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Hi, thanks so much. What was my question? I'm sorry, I'm doing a few things right now. Martha, I find your work really beautiful, and I also see a lot of resonance to the work of your father. And I wonder if how you feel it relates to his influence or to other artists' work, and also just sort of, are you tired of asking and answering this kind of question?
No, I'm not tired of it in any way, but I think my answer changes. How do I feel? Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, I'm probably more influenced directly by my mother's work, and her subject matter and engaging with, whether it be stars or plants. I think my father's work has a sense of delicacy and awareness and trust of material that I think I absolutely learned from. So that probably goes together. I think something that I've been thinking a lot about is that is kind of an influence, and this is not to my parents are both really special people, and was great to grow up with them, but I think the art world that I grew up in was one in which was you know, as a white, that there was a lot that I absorbed in that wasn't, that I'm questioning. And so I think more than any, I'm thinking that the positive and then the outer influence, that there's a lot to, as I'm trying to figure out how to make an offering towards creating a new art world, that there's influence there to work out. So I like the question, but I'm also been trying to be on myself to be very honest about the answer.
I really appreciate that, and I'm sorry, I don't know the work of your mother's work very well at all. So but I recognize that that would be a deeper relationship for you, and also that it's a complicated sort of context to have to navigate, like the art world versus your sort of real world relationships, let's say.
No,
so thank you.
I appreciate the chance to rethink it.
Thank you, Martha and Deanna. Next, we'll go to JC.
Martha and Susan, thank you for this conversation. Martha, I love the way your work kind of troubles the human natural divide, something that's very dear to me. My question's very simple though. I'm interested, or I guess, I know you work with mythology a lot, and I was wondering if you would share maybe your favorite kind of scene from mythology, or I guess I know you return to Ovid a bunch, so maybe you can talk about your favorite scene from the Metamorphoses.
Mm-hmm. I really love the way that Donna Haraway in her book Returning to the Trouble, my brain just froze, so maybe that's talks about Medusa, and so I think I'm going to give you a hybrid answer that I love the story of Medusa and Perseus. Italo Calvino also has this beautiful description of Medusa's head in Lightness, in which he refers to the gentle way in which Perseus places Medusa's head onto the seaweed and turns the seaweed to coral. But then, of course, Donna Haraway, in thinking about interspecies collaborations, uses Medusa as a way to talk about the witch and the mother and the transformer. And so I've been thinking about all three of those writers in collaboration to forming a relationship to the myth of Medusa and her death.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, Lightness is like, all of those
That's
writers.
so beautiful.
I say is like so dear to my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And thank you everyone for your questions. This has been an enlightening discussion. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our lunch with a poem, and we've carried that into these community talks. And today we're thrilled to welcome the poet Gabriel Dozal to the stage. Gabriel Dozal is from El Paso, Texas, and he received his MFA in poetry from the University of Arizona. His work appears in Guernica, the Iowa Review, the Brooklyn Rail, the Literary Review, Hunger Mountain, the Volta, Contraviento, A Dozen Nothing, and is forthcoming in Dredgenold. Gabriel, handing the mic over to you.
Hi, how are you doing? A few quick notes before I begin these poems, but first thank you to Martha and Susan and the Brooklyn Rail for letting me listen in to this great convo. I loved hearing about your process and your thoughts behind your pieces, Martha. Thank you to Madeline and Anselm Berrigan for reaching out to me for this, and thank you to Anselm for publishing me in the October 2019 Brooklyn Rail, which was right there. I've admired the Brooklyn Rail for a long time, and as a poet, knowing that people who are not poets might read your work in the Brooklyn Rail, such as artists, that means a lot to me. Okay, so a few things about these poems. These are 5 short poems that I'm going to read. There's a few characters that kind of stand in for larger people that exist on the border. There's customs, crossers, a character named Primitivo and his sister Primitiva, and both those names in Spanish just mean firstborn. All these characters inhabit a border world of Texas and Mexico. A fabrica is a manufacturer, usually of clothes and textiles. A maquila is also a manufacturer, but usually with more machine making. A juki and a brother, for those who don't know, are industrial sewing machines or sewing machines. The word thock, T-H-O-C-K, a thock is the sound that keys make on a keyboard when you're pressing them. And finally, robaron is Spanish, the past tense of steal and to rob. Okay, so here we go. And a quick shout out to my friends, James and Dorian, who are watching right now. This piece is called People Who Work Here Don't Work Here. The hook timing was off on my juki, but my brother was roiling. In the spirit of secrets, let me tell you, I overheard my supervisor spit to her boss. Where were you while we were getting high on bilingual employees? Another scraper comes off the molder in the maquila next door. I was hired here at the fabrica because I could receive a pronunciation. The border, my boss, never apologizes because the border wants what we all want. Crowds combed with guest workers waiting in line. We're all dial tones, my boss says. All works tied up in the wreath of our times, and the wreath is me, primitiva. I'm a visual story sold by the manufacturer. A maquila needs fiction to run, so they need my story, duh. Primitivo hears his thock in the data entry hut. All his friends are also known for their thock. When customs presses their key, the crosser responds with pleasing sounds, letting customs know their entry was recorded. When Primitivo and his friends make the wrong sound, they're not allowed to pass into simulation. Instead, they're sent to the desert to find ones, loved, enemies, frenemies, bags of stuff, lighters, Pedialyte, deodorant. Primitivo tells customs, the story of evidence is a desert, a useless t-shirt that states suerte. I particularly want to highlight the roll-on stick. Primitivo's friends care about their smell, their hair, they're there. Okay. I can't offer you solstice. No, solace. So please, don't cry inside me again. Customs lets you into simulation if you're polished, inside and out. The crosser's inside is unpolishable because it's a room the crosser can't find. I'm the crosser, and the room I live in has two entrances. A situation that's been imprinted on me, and here's the situation. I can't write a border better than the real border. I'm instructed by customs to open the room that is easiest to access in my mind's eye. And my mind's eye is a car show from Robaron Fest. Robaron is the past tense of to rob in Spanish. You steal time, but please, never buy it. Customs will give you so much time that you won't have any of it. Customs talks in a kiosk about the same landscape, a fabrica that skirts and preys on wages. Those dollar signs are the fabric that shape our skirt. We make the fabric, we make the landscape, and then we make the day. All day you're on the line and you have to live in other people's thoughts. There's more truth and untruth about the border. How do you feel so hungry and full at the same time? The past, like the border, is its own country. You bring a camcorder into the maquila so that later you can relive your dissonance. Whoops, relieve your dissonance. It's hard to tell. I'll have to quit. Other people's thoughts are the jukis I love to leave in the past. Our ID cards are decorative till the end of our shift. We switch off with someone else, some other worker who will wipe the serenade from our eyes so that we can see what's among us crossers. It's hard to tell who is already a fence. A series of myths about being called in early sweeps through the work floor. Okay, and this is the last part of this series. This is called The Pronoun in the Machine. All our conversations with customs are just throat clearing. My boss says I'm a visual story. I put on my mask and my mask puts on me. You know when customs talks behind your back, in front of you? Customs is open source. Anyone can become one, a source. Everyone lives in fear of the virtual borderdom. The only thing we know about the border is what falls into frame. To customs, the crosser is the coin of our realm, and the border simulator is a mockbuster, where colleagues fall into canyons buried among lanyards and fobs. You knew how to conjugate English in the fog of a Spanglish border of receiving and ends. Are we all getting into the van? How will we fit? Customs will morally conjugate this event for you. We'll smuggle these crossers, and while we're at it, we'll smuggle in these wall prototypes, this impenetrable rhetorical situation. You knew how to conjugate in Spanish. The crosser doesn't know how to conjugate in English, nor can Primitivo conjugate this moment. Pobrecito. Binders, baskets, who knows? There's all kinds of fences who know not what they cross. What Primitivo crosses is water on the way to mop the factory floor. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. That was wonderful. And thank you, Martha and Susan, for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our audience for their questions. We do this every weekday at 1 p.m., so join us on Monday for a conversation with Thelma Golden, Glenn Lowry, Helen Lee, and Joaquin Pizarro. Thanks again, everyone. Please feel free to turn on your microphone and say goodbye, hello, thank yous. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Gabriel. Great poem.
Thank you,
Thank you
Gabriel.
all.
Great.
See you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Thank you.
Hey, Andrew. Good to see you. Glad you could come.
Hi, Justin.
Wow, Justin. Great hair today.
Jason.
Yeah.
Hey, buddy.
It's that phase of quarantine.
Where are you, hon?
Hey, Jason. How you doing?
Hey, Heidi.
Hey, Hearn.
Hey, hon. Need to talk to you later, okay? Thank you.
Yeah, can't wait to read that review.
Okay. Yeah, hon, let's see if we can get Wayne Thibault on. I will call you later. Yeah. Susan,
Yes.
thanks for a
Thanks,
lovely
Susan.
job.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Susan. Great to see you as always.
Awesome. It was
Really
great. Thank
I
you,
think
you guys.
It was fun, but it was
Thank
really
you, Louis. Ciao.
And have a good weekend.
wow.
Yes. Have a great weekend.
Hey, Sai.
Hey, Si.